Eric Prince stared at his wife as she berated him once more for losing his job. While Eric had been laid off from his teaching position because of the economy, he was slated to be let go regardless because of his poor evaluations, just as he had from his prior teaching position. Eric was not able to effectively teach his students, and he was generally considered to be unable to relate to them despite the fact that he was a young teacher. Given the cutbacks at other neighboring schools, Eric's job hunt was not going well. While they did not need the money because of his wife's inheritance, Bianca was not about to let her husband lie around the house while she went to work. Bianca had tried to get her husband to relate to his students better. She had given him advice, but he had largely ignored it. That was grated on her the most. Bianca was far more experienced working with teenagers than Eric was, but he did not listen to her when it came to his work. It was the one area that Eric felt independent from Bianca. That fact made him hesitant to ever let her meddle in his employment-related affairs. Bianca was several years older than Eric. She was the headmistress of a private all-girls school that had been set up by an endowment from her great-grandparents. All of the headmistresses at the increasingly prestigious school had come from Bianca's family. Bianca had succeeded her mother when she retired a few years earlier. Eric met Bianca not long after that. Eric was a recent graduate of college and had just landed his first job as a teacher in the local school district when he met her at a supermarket. Although Bianca was 10 years older than him, he found her to be very attractive. She had long legs and youthful appearance. Bianca was instantly drawn to Eric as well. He provided her with some youthful energy that she could not get enough of and also was in position to submit to her desires. Power was important to Bianca. She loved to wield it over her lovers. Eric was the perfect mix to her of a man who needed her, but who could also stand on his own. That was the type of man she took the most pleasure in dominating. Bianca in turn provided Eric with the financial support and love that had been absent in his life. His father died when he was young and his mother never had much money to her name. She died while he was in college during a coronary bypass surgery due to a complication with the anesthesia. After her death, he was left reeling and tried to find comfort in the arms of other women. Bianca provided him with a love that had been missing from his life as well as an authority figure that helped keep his mind focused. Eric rarely fought back against Bianca's wishes. He usually found that it was best for both of them if he acquiesced to her requests. Eric was perfectly happy with their relationship, even though he knew that it was hardly a relationship of equals. Eric was willing to let Bianca take the dominant role in the relationship because it served his greater purposes in life. The only thing that kept Eric from considering himself a kept man was the fact that he had a job that would allow him to pay his own bills, albeit in far less lavish surroundings than Bianca's large home in a wealthy neighborhood. While his reliance on his wife's wealth shamed him slightly, he found that it was easy to get over the fact that he was not the provider he felt he should be because it also meant that he did not have anything to worry about financially. Bianca pondered her husband's future as her neighbor and close friend Willow Potts knocked upon her front door. Bianca let her in while Eric never moved off of the couch he was watching a television show on. Willow said hello to Eric, who politely waved as his eyes never left the television screen. Willow sat down with Bianca in the kitchen and asked, "Is he all right?" Bianca shook her head as she replied, "He's okay. He's just depressed. He still can't find anything?" Bianca shook her head in silence as she took a sip of her tea before she began to make a cup for Willow. As she did so, Willow asked, "When he finds another job, have you figured out a way to make him, good at it?" Bianca laughed as she replied, "If he would just listen to me, he wouldn't be in this situation, but he's too hard-headed. You would think the first failure would have gotten him to reconsider his positions, but instead he just retrenched." Eric shook his head as he heard his wife's words from the couch. He turned up the volume on the television to try to tune out their conversation. Willow responded, "Is that why you never hired him to teach at your school?" Bianca smiled as she answered, "Well, there's that and the fact that we've never had a male teacher since the school opened. We try to be an all-girls school from top to the bottom." Well, maybe he'd do better with his future students if he got to hang around the girls from your school, Willow said with a smile. I think some of the parents would have a problem with that, Bianca replied as a smirk came across her face as she handed Willow a cup of tea. Willow took a sip while Bianca sat down before she said, well, maybe they wouldn't have a problem if he was one of the girls. Bianca laughed and said, I'm sure that would lead to a different set of problems. Why? Have you ever thought about it? Thought about what? Bringing him to school as just one of the girls. Bianca shook her head as she answered in a slowly, I can't say that I have. Besides, I already told you what's been said about his teaching skills, and I only bring in the best teachers for my girls. I owe it to them. Eric grimaced as he heard his wife's words. His attempts to drown out their conversation were failing miserably. He tossed the remote against the couch and got to his feet. He walked into the kitchen and stared at Willow, who had gone silent as she heard Eric stirring in the other room. Willow smiled at Eric and said, Are you joining us? Eric shook his head before Willow continued, Well, Bianca, I didn't mean that you should bring Eric on as a female teacher, I meant that you should bring him on as a female student. Eric's head jerked towards Willow, prompting Bianca to smirk as she responded, Well, I don't know about that. I don't think my husband would look too good in one of our plaid jumpers. I think you're wrong, Bianca. I mean, look at him. He's already a wiry little guy. He'd be a waif of a girl. He's only 5 feet 8 inches, which is tall for a girl, but not unusually so. He could be the Taylor Swift of your school. Willow's word made Bianca laugh. Eric glared at Willow as he felt angry and humiliated at the same time by Willow's description of him in such feminine terms. Bianca could see Eric's displeasure and decided to have a little fun at his expense as she replied, Well, now that you mention it, he does have the legs for a skirt. Eric's head slowly turned to Bianca. She smirked at his scowl as Willow added, I mean, with a little work, he'd look just like one of the girls from your school's volleyball team. I think the shorts would tell a different story though, Eric interjected. Well, yes, that would be a giveaway if it was still visible, Willow replied before she took another sip of her tea. Where's it supposed to go? Eric replied while he shook her head. They have prosthetics for that sort of thing, Eric, Willow answered. Who? Eric asked as he threw up his hands. Wouldn't you like to know? Willow said before taking another sip. I'd sure like to know, Bianca interjected. Willow responded, I know of a little clinic that could get rid of Eric's little tells and make him look like he's just another girl at the academy. I doubt it, Eric retorted. I wouldn't. Everything male about you is easily concealable. You have effeminate features and you're thinner than most girls. They could make quite the woman out of you. I'm so sure, Eric said as he blushed and shook his head. Eric felt sickened by her use of the word effeminate to describe him. It was a term he had tried to fight against most of his life. Eric had been teased his whole childhood over his slender physique and subpar physical strength. He was frequently picked on and teased for being weak. As he went through puberty, the number of homophobic remarks thrown his way became impossible to count. In addition to slurring his sexuality with baseless accusations of homosexuality, Eric also had to contend with rumors that he had an eating disorder. Eric had difficulty gaining weight and had actively sought to build muscle mass as a teenager. His attempts, however, failed to gain him much strength or muscle mass. Eric had become more comfortable with his physique over the years. He had come to stop bemoaning it and accepted it as part of who he was. That was made much easier once he met Bianca. He knew that she was drawn to him because of his slender body and pretty boy looks that had so often made him the target of ridicule. Bianca's praise for Eric's appearance was often mixed with subtle reminders of her dominant role in their relationship. Eric would blush whenever Bianca reminded him of her 30-pound weight advantage or that she was 3 inches taller than him. Eric picked up on her hints that she could overpower him if she wanted to, but Bianca never actually tried to do so. Willow smiled at Eric and said, I know they could make a great girl out of you. Bianca put her cup of tea on the countertop and said, What are you really talking about? There's a clinic in the city that specializes in treatments that let people like Eric go deep undercover as someone else, Willow explained. Really? Bianca asked. The intrigue in his wife's voice made Eric nervous before he interjected, "It doesn't matter. I wouldn't do it anyway." Why not? Bianca asked. Are you being serious? Eric replied. I sure am. Well, tell me, dear, why would I want to be a teenage girl? It would help you learn to relate to the students you'd have if you ever get another job again. How kids actually learn is not something they teach you in school. You can't get it from a book. I know that, but why couldn't I be a guy? And what school could we get you into if you went back as a guy? This only works because I could sign you up for my school with full phony records to get you in. Willow smirked as she listened and knew that Bianca's belief was inaccurate, but given Eric's failure to use his male teenage experience as a resource to relate back to as he tried to educate his students, she figured it was best if she kept her mouth shut. Eric responded, "It's out of the question." Oh, you're too good to try to actually be good at what you do. Do you know how many strings I had to pull to get you your last job? Every time you lose one, it makes it harder for another school to take a fresh look at you. Eric nodded his head and agreed with her assessment, but he replied, I get that, I do. It's just that I can't do it. You can't expect me to agree to it either. It's not a realistic solution to the problem. Bianca shook her head as she retorted, not realistic? Okay, let me give you a little realism, dear. You're unemployed, sponging off your wife and, now, telling her that you won't take any help from her to help keep you employed the next time you get a job. That's the same little mistake that you kept making when you had a job. While you might be happy being a layabout around here, I'm not. I expect you to work, and if that means trying to better yourself, you'd better do it or you're out of here. Eric nodded as he replied, okay, it's no problem at all, Willow. Willow smiled and exited the home. As she did so, Alice walked over to Eric and asked, do you want to play Barbies? Eric shrugged and said, sure, why not? Eric played with the toys with Alice and laughed as she paired her Barbie up with a Ken doll even while she said that boys are gross. Eric smiled as he played with Alice and thought to himself, maybe having kids wouldn't be that bad. While Bianca wanted a child, Eric was reluctant to have one. He felt uncomfortable with having to take responsibility for another person. He did not even like the responsibility of having pets, so the thought of having a child seemed like more than he could bear. However, as he spent more time with Alice, he noted that there were good parts to it that he had not considered in the past. Shortly after Willow came back, she got herself, Adam, and Alice ready for a night out. She then said goodbye to Eric, and she told him to look after the house while they were gone. Eric nodded and was happy to wave goodbye to them as he had the house to himself. Eric smirked as he looked around the home and tried to act like a man as he walked around dressed in black, boot-cut yoga pants with a graphic print reading Love Pink in bold letters on the waist and a plain black t-shirt, which was the closest thing to a unisexual piece of clothing Willow and Bianca let him wear. Eric felt that thinking of himself as a grown man was farcical once he caught sight of himself in the mirror in the hallway. Eric stared at his reflection and saw the unmistakable image of a teenage girl that contrasted with his attempts to pretend that he was the man he knew he actually was. As Eric gazed vacantly into the mirror, he heard a knock on the front door. He walked towards the door and looked through the window beside the door. He saw Bianca standing in front of the door and sighed. Eric drew the door open and stared at his wife for a second before he said, "Good evening, Headmistress Jones." "How are you, Jasmine?" Bianca replied with a smile as she noticed that Eric had not slipped and called her by her first name. "I'm good, you," Eric replied. "Good. Can I come in?" Eric shrugged and let her in. Bianca looked around and asked, "Bianca and the kids are gone?" "Yes, they had a party," Eric answered as he walked towards the kitchen and offered Bianca something to drink. Bianca declined and said, "Can we sit and talk for a moment?" Eric shrugged and said, "Sure." Bianca led Eric into Willow's living room and took a seat on the couch. She patted the seat next to her and said, "Please have a seat." Eric shook his head as he sat next to his wife, looking considerably more like her daughter than her husband. Bianca asked, "How have you been adjusting?" "I think you've seen it," Eric answered, not wanting to let Bianca humiliate him any further by admitting anything about his temporary life. "I sure have, and I have to say, I think you're learning what it's like to be a teenager in this environment." "I would say so." "Okay, but do you think you know how to teach the girls at your school?" "I would like to think I do," Eric answered, even as he was unsure if his new experiences would help him connect with students in a way that would engage them in the learning process. "How have you liked spending time with the Potts?" Bianca asked. "Oh, it's just great," Eric replied as he glared at his wife. Bianca tilted her head as she heard his sarcastic tone and said, "Oh, come on. It can't be that bad. They're not mean to me or anything, but they treat me like I'm a 14-year-old girl?" "Yes." Bianca laughed and said, "How else would Alice and Adam treat you? They don't know who you really are." "But what about Willow? How else could she treat you in front of her kids?" "Again, they think you're a 14-year-old girl." "And you?" "Me? I'm your headmistress. I can't be giving you special treatment. I know why I can't stay with you, but why can't you treat me like a man when we're together? It's a little hard to think of you as a man when I'm seeing you sitting pretty like this." Eric blushed as he replied, "I can understand that. I'm glad, but I know that you're still my husband under all those prosthetics," Bianca replied as she brushed Eric's hair out of his face. Eric smiled at her as he liked the feeling of her hand on his skin. Bianca smiled at Eric and asked, "Come on, it can't all be bad, can it?" "No. I'm learning some things. I was watching Alice today too and—" "You were babysitting Alice?" Bianca asked before letting out a brief laugh. "Yes. What's so funny? Mr. I'm never going to have a kid is watching a kid." "Well, you know you called me Mr., right, headmistress?" Eric replied with a wink. "Well, a little slip-up doesn't matter when we're behind closed doors." Eric smiled at his wife and said, "I don't know when Mrs. Potts will be back." Bianca laughed as she replied, "Oh, I don't want to get you in trouble for having a girl over." "I like trouble." "Oh, you naughty girl. I'm going to have to discipline you," Bianca said with a grin as he put her hand on his shoulder. "Don't you think that some people might find this to be inappropriate?" Eric asked. "Oh, I don't know why. I'm just giving you a good education." Eric smiled as he said, "I'm sure you are. I've already learned so much." "But you have so much more to learn," Bianca said as she leaned towards him and patted his knee. The feeling of Bianca's hand on his knee felt right to Eric. All the pent-up sexual emotions he had come out as he exclaimed, "I can't wait to have you again, Bianca. I don't care what it takes, and if you want a kid, I can't wait to give one to you." "A kid?" Bianca asked as she moved her head away from him. "Yes," Eric replied. "You want a kid? Well, why not? Are you just trying to get out of skirts a little earlier than planned, or are you serious?" "I'm serious." "Well, I think you'll make a great dad or a second mother, that'll be your call." "What do you mean?" "Well, if you show me you've learned what it takes to be a great teacher, and you should given that you're in the classes with some of the best, I'll give you a position at my school next fall if you can't get your own." "That's very nice, dear, but I think that would interfere with the whole children thing." "Oh, you won't need that prosthesis. You're not changing with any of the girls. You'll just be a girl with a little something that makes you my husband after school." Eric smirked at the thought. While he hoped to find a job on his own, the picture his wife was painting of his alternative future certainly had an appeal of its own. Bianca stood up and looked down at Eric as she said, "Now, all you've got to do is spend the next 5 months proving to me that you've got what it takes before we change you back to go on interviews in the spring." Eric gulped as he thought about his immediate future. He was going to be spending many more weeks in skirts and jumpers beside the teenage girls he called classmates. As Bianca smiled and walked out the door, Eric felt faint as he wondered how he could tolerate being a teenage girl for another 5 months. He could only hope that the promise of what lay down the road for him would make it all somehow tolerable. "It's not like that," Eric responded as a growing feeling of urgency arose inside of him. He began to wonder if his wife was serious about throwing him out. He knew that their prenuptial agreement was written so that they would both keep what they brought into the marriage. It was an agreement that strongly favored his old money wife. "Then what's it like? Look, I'll do whatever you want me to do. I've learned that I need your help. I got that, now. I swear I do. I won't blow you off anymore when you give me advice. I know that you've been relating to students far longer than me, but I think you'd have to agree that what you're asking me to do is a little much." "I think it's necessary," Bianca said as she turned to Willow, who nodded in support of her neighbor and friend. "You want me to spend some time looking like a teenage girl? I wouldn't be able to look for another job or even go out among other adults if I looked a girl. You were never much for going out anyway, and you know, there won't be full-time job openings until next spring. I really don't see what the problem is." "How can you not?" Eric shouted. Bianca glared at Eric. Eric stooped a little as he knew that he had angered the woman who alone could make his life significantly worse. Bianca knew that Eric was anxious as he stood before. She thought that what her friend was proposing was the best thing for husband at that moment. Bianca spoke in the sternest tone she reserved for her school's wayward girls. "So what's it going to be?" Eric stared down at the floor and said, "I'll do what you think is best." Bianca clapped her hands and said, "Fantastic. So, Willow, where is this place you've talking about it?" Willow gave Bianca the contact information for the clinic that she had been talking about. Bianca called the number and made arrangements for Eric to be brought there. As she sat back down with Willow and Eric, Bianca said, "The clinic told me that they're going to need an address for Eric's new feminine identity." Willow smiled before she said, "Give them my address. You could sign him up at your school as an exchange student." "That's not a bad idea. We couldn't be signing him up with my address. That would just look weird." "Yes, the headmistress can't be living with a student that isn't related to her," Willow replied as Eric listened in silence as his wife and her friend made plans for him like he was not there. "God, it's like I'm already a child," Eric thought as he felt sick to his stomach. He excused himself and walked outside. Eric sat on the front porch and clasped his head and wondered how he had let things spiral so out of control in such a short period of time. As Eric bemoaned his situation, Bianca and Willow kept making plans for him. Willow and Bianca decided that Eric would stay with Willow after he got home from the clinic. Willow was happy with the plan as she was a single mother and felt that she could use some help around the home. Willow had been widowed 3 years earlier after her husband's death from pancreatic cancer. She had 2 children from her marriage, a 13-year-old son named Adam and a 6-year-old daughter named Alice. Willow and Bianca decided between themselves that it would be best to not tell Eric about his future living arrangements until after he underwent his treatments at the clinic. Willow then dismissed herself to go pick up her daughter from her ballet practice. Eric awoke the day of his scheduled trip to the clinic with a feeling of trepidation. He knew that there was no way out of it. He had agreed to his wife's demands so that he could maintain the standard of living that he had become accustomed to. Bianca was up and walking around and getting ready to leave when he awoke. Bianca smiled down at him as he lay in the bed as she said, "Sleeping late, well, that's one of the things you're going to have to give up once you're a girl." Eric rubbed his face as he heard Bianca's laughter as she put on a pair of pants from her closet. Eric rolled out of bed and stumbled to the bathroom. Once he finished in it, he came out and dressed in a pair of jeans and a t-shirt. Bianca smiled at his ensemble and said, "Did you notice how quick you got ready to go?" Eric shrugged before Bianca said, "You're going to look back at that sometime soon and realize just how lucky you are to have that little things between your legs." Eric blushed at her description of his member. While she did not mean to make him self-conscious about it, he could not help it as he was one of the countless men who wished his member was a little larger. Eric walked down the stairs and ate a quick breakfast before he collected his wallet and headed out the door beside Bianca. Bianca walked to the driver's side of the car, which was unusual. As Eric usually drove then, he asked, "Here, Bianca's, what's going on?" Bianca replied, "Well, since you're going to be a girl." "Quiet down," Eric begged as he looked around the empty neighborhood streets. "Then get in the car and we'll discuss it," Bianca replied. Eric hastily got into the passenger seat and Bianca pulled the car out of the driveway. As they drove to the clinic, Bianca explained that she was driving to help get him into the proper mindset of the teenage girl he was going to be. Eric accepted her theory, but still felt uneasy about going through with his wife's plan. Bianca noticed Eric's nervousness and tried her best to calm him down. Her efforts only worked for a few seconds before his trepidation would reemerge. As they drew closer to the clinic, Eric begged for her to reconsider what they were doing. Bianca shook her head and said, "If you're not willing to improve yourself to get a new job, why should I keep you around? There's got to be a better way." "I'm sure there is, but you haven't given me one to consider," Bianca replied. Eric nodded and realized that instead of ruining his situation, he should have been trying to pitch Bianca alternatives. He tried to think of ones in haste as the GPS indicated that the clinic was only 2 blocks north. Eric frantically said everything that came into his mind, but each option he presented was dismissed offhand by Bianca for various reasons. As the car came to a stop in front of the clinic, Eric resigned himself to his fate. Eric felt that he could have fought her decision harder, but he knew that the time for that had long since passed. There was no changing Bianca's mind now. He knew that once she had her mind set on something, nothing could sway her. Bianca and Eric exited the car and headed towards the discreetly named building. They were let by 2 staff members and brought inside. As Bianca filled out his intake paperwork, Eric looked around the lobby as he saw people waiting to be picked up. He wondered who they really were, assuming that they had gone through the types of radical makeovers that he had heard that the clinic specialized in. Bianca then tapped Eric on the shoulder and said, "They're going to be taking you in now." "Are you sure about this?" Eric asked as he gave her the saddest look he could manage. "It's for the best, dear," Bianca said before she kissed him on the lips and said, "I'm going to miss that though." The lingering taste of her lipstick was left on Eric's lips as he watched Bianca walk towards the door. She smiled at him before the door to the clinic was opened by 2 staff members to let her exit. As Bianca walked out of the clinic, Eric was escorted into a room by a member of the staff. The staff member helped disrobe Eric to his dismay. He hated being naked around strangers and did his best to maintain his modesty before the man left the room. The man left without saying a word about Eric's body, which made him feel slightly better about his situation. Eric was left alone in the room and stared at the shower stall before a middle-aged woman walked into the room. Eric did not move as he did not want to reveal his privates to the woman as she approached him. She smiled at his feeble attempts at maintaining his modesty before she placed a pair of goggles on his head. She then placed a tight plastic cap that extended from just under his goggles and was pulled over his head. Eric felt disoriented as the black cap made him blind as it was pulled tightly down the side of his head and came to a stop just over the beginning of his neck. Eric felt a slight bit of pain from the uncomfortable way his skin was being pulled by the tight plastic cap on his head before he felt a mist being sprayed onto his body. "What are you doing?" "Giving you a depilation treatment. Now, keep your mouth shut. Trust me, you don't want to swallow any of this stuff." The woman's remark made Eric tremble with fear. He closed his mouth and felt the mist being sprayed against his face. The woman then said, "Just keep your mouth shut for a few more minutes and this will all be over." Eric nodded as he began to feel a hot sensation climbing his legs from where he had been sprayed first. The woman noticed Eric's growing unease and started to spray off the hair remover that remained on his skin. A sense of relief came over Eric as he felt the cool liquid slowly ascending his body and eliminating the burning feeling that was overtaking his skin. When the woman finished, she removed the plastic cap from Eric's head. Eric cringed as his dilated pupils reacted negatively to the bright fluorescent lighting of the room. As Eric's eyes adjusted to the light, he noticed that the burning feeling he had sensed had caused the removal of his body hair. Eric sighed at how feminine his slender body looked without body hair, with the exception of his flat chest and groin. The woman then handed Eric a towel to dry himself with. Eric patted himself dry at the woman's instructions before another staff member entered the room while Eric was wrapping the towel around his waist. Eric was then escorted into another room, dressed only in the white towel he was given. Eric was told to lie down on the examination table in the middle of the room to wait for the technician. Eric felt a bit uneasy as he followed the girl's direction. A nervous feeling gnawed at Eric as he counted the tiles on the ceiling and tried not to think about what would happen to him next. Eric's attempt at putting the day's events out of his mind came to an abrupt end as he heard the door to the room open. A young technician dressed in a blouse and a pair of black leggings walked in. Eric's eyes glanced at her breasts before he looked at her slender figure that was adorned with her skin-tight clothing. Eric could not help but feel attracted to her and felt his members start to twitch. He looked away from her and tried to calm himself down by thinking of unattractive things. Eric knew that the woman he found so attractive was going to be feminizing him in some way. He did not want her to think that he wanted to be undergoing the procedure, even though he knew that her opinion of him made no difference as he was a married man. The young technician said hello to him before she said, "Okay, now, let's get started. So I'm going to need to see what I have to work with," before she pulled the towel away from his body. Eric's hands instinctively reached to cover his still erect member. The girl smiled and said, "Oh, I can see someone is eager to get started." Eric shook his head as he blushed and said, "No. I really don't want to do this. I'm only doing for my wife." The girl gave Eric a skeptical look before she rolled her eyes and said, "Oh, yes. I know that men are always making women out of themselves because their wives say so." Eric shook his head as she wheeled over a steel cart containing supplies that she would need for her tasks. As the girl stood over him and began to make a mold of his chest, Eric said, "I know it sounds ridiculous, but I'm doing it for her." The girl looked at Eric and said, "Look, we can stop this right now. I'll take this stuff off your chest, we'll give your clothes and let you walk out the door. We're not going to do something to you against your will. That's not what anybody in this facility is in this for. So do you want us to stop?" Eric thought about his wife's threats. He knew that he could not stop. He shook his head, prompting the girl to smile as she said, "I knew that the lady doth protest too much," before she removed the mold from his chest. Eric blushed as he reconsidered his options. The same scenarios that played out in his imagination before came to the forefront of his mind. Eric felt that he had no other choice. The girl then came back over to Eric with two flesh-colored mounds that caught his eyes immediately. Eric looked at them, knowing what they were, and thought they were jiggling like jello. The girl began to apply a solution to the back of one of the mounds and placed it against his chest. Eric closed his eyes as he felt the cold adhesive being pressed against his chest to secure the left breast form. The girl then repeated her task with the other breast form. As she finished, Eric gazed down at the B-cup breast forms that were preventing him from looking down at the rest of his body as he lay on the examination table. The woman then said, "Okay, now, I'm going to move on to your crotch. So you're going to feel some pulling when I'm doing this, okay?" Eric nodded at her as he tried to not think about her warm, smooth hands touching his privates. Eric felt a feeling of arousal as he felt her take his penis in one hand. Her hand felt like silk and he immediately felt his member becoming erect before he felt her pushing his testicles up into his body. The feeling felt unnatural to him before he sensed his member being twisted about uncomfortably. A cold sensation then followed. Eric knew that the prosthetic he could not see had been added to his crotch. He had a good idea about what it was given the day's events and Willow's earlier comments, but he was unable to confirm his fears at that moment. The technician moved towards his chest and inspected his breast forms before she began to mix a special paint for the forms. Eric tried to not think of what he would look like from the neck down when he saw himself in the mirror. He knew that given his smooth, slender, and now curved body, he would like a woman with a male head. The idea disgusted him, and he hoped that few people would see him like that, even though he knew that it was probably old hat to every person in the facility. The technician moved away from the paint to let it settle. She walked over towards Eric and stared at his face. "What is it?" Eric asked as he felt uneasy looking at her expressionless visage examining his face. "I'm just determining what kind of prosthetics you need on your face." "What do I need?" "You'll find out shortly," the technician responded with a smile as she turned away from him. The girl then began to take a mold of his nose and chin, giving Eric an obvious idea of what she was planning to do him next. After she removed the molds, she prepared the prosthetics for his face before she applied the paint to his breast and vagina forms. Eric watched her as she applied the paint to his breast forms. Eric noticed that the coloring matched his skin tone precisely. The technician applied the paint so as to create a seamless flow from the breast forms to his flesh. Eric stared down at his chest, stunned by how real they looked. He was horrified by them in some ways, but he was in awe of the talent of the technician. They looked real to him as he went to touch them. The technician noticed and said, "No. No. Don't touch them until I say it's okay." Eric nodded as he puts his hands back down on the examination table. When the technician finished painting his vagina prosthetic, she turned her attention to his face. She removed the prosthetics from the molds she created and carefully affixed them to his face with the powerful adhesive. She smiled at the way the prosthetics smoothed out his chin and gave him a more rounded nose, which was the most effeminate shape she could make his nose. While his nose was larger than most girls', the technician knew that it was within the realm of normal for girls. The technician then turned her attention to Eric's neck and his slightly visible Adam's apple. She smiled at him before she took hold of a small electronic device. "Now, stay still," the technician said as she leaned over Eric's body. Eric could not help but to stare down at her cleavage that was exposed beneath the plunging V neckline of her blouse. Eric felt the device being affixed to his throat and felt a slight clamping feeling on it. He went to pull at it, but the technician slapped his hands and said, "Don't touch it. It's supposed to feel that way." "Why?" Eric shrieked in a high-pitched voice that shocked him. "That's why," the technician retorted with a smile. "What the hell did you do to me?" Eric asked in his unambiguously feminine tone. "It's nothing permanent. It's just something to make your voice a little more feminine." "A little bit more," Eric screeched. "Yes, the device is just putting pressure on your voice box and your vocal cords. It's constricting them a little to change to your tone. The constriction is making it harder, if not impossible, to produce the deeper tones we expect from men." Eric nodded and tried to not speak as he was embarrassed by his voice before the technician made him mold his neck. While she waited for the neck prosthetic to be ready, she painted his nose and chin before she walked over to the phone hanging on the wall and made a call. The technician smiled at Eric as she walked back over and sat him up. Eric tried his best to peer down his chest at his crotch and was able to almost see the smoothness that had taken the place of his manhood. The technician slapped Eric's arm and said, "You boys are all the same. The first thing you want to see is your pussy." Eric blushed again before a woman walked into the room while pushing a metal cart through the doorway. Eric instinctively covered his crotch again. The smooth feeling made him pull his hand away as he was shocked by how strange the emptiness felt. The woman introduced herself as the clinic's resident beautician. Eric smiled and said hello to her before his curiosity got the better of him and he reached for the mounds that were jiggling on his chest as he moved. He touched them and felt the softness of his breasts that seemed softer than his own as skin. The beautician and technician laughed at Eric's act, prompting him to drop his hands as he blushed. The beautician then took hold of Eric's hands and said, "I'll have to do something about these nails." Eric wondered what she was going to do before she started to mix a foul-smelling solution on the cart and then took hold of 2 bottles of nail polish. Eric watched as she gave him a French pedicure before she applied the solution to his nails to prime them for the application of acrylic nails. She then applied the glue to his nails and secured the acrylic nail tips to each of his fingers. The beautician shaped the nails to provide for the desired just over the fingertip length before she let the technician apply the prosthetic over Eric's throat. When it was in place, the beautician gave a French manicure to his fingernails that matched the coloring of his toenails. The beautician then said goodbye to Eric and the technician before she mentioned that she would be seeing Eric again. Eric did not pay much attention to her words as he was obsessed by how feminine every piece of his body that he could see looked. The technician then had Eric lay down on the examination table after his nail polish had finished drying. The technician painted Eric's throat prosthetic to make it match his skin tone before she sat him and asked, "What would you like for lunch?" "Lunch?" Eric asked, not feeling the slightest bit hungry. "Yes, it's 2 o'clock. "Really?" Eric replied as he realized that he had lost all conception of time. "Yes, now, what will it be?" "Well, what are my options? We want you to lose some weight, so you have 2 choices, salad or yogurt." "I'm not really a salad person," Eric replied. "Well, that will have to change, but right now, I'll order you a yogurt." "One yogurt?" Eric asked in almost childish tone that embarrassed him. "A girl's got to starve herself to stay thin. Beauty has a price, dear." Eric nodded, unhappy about his situation, but well aware that there was little he could do to change it at the moment. The technician called in an order for him as he waited for the paint on his neck prosthesis to dry. A staff member brought Eric a container of yogurt and a spoon. Eric ate the yogurt without incident as the technician watched his throat prosthesis as he swallowed. When he finished the yogurt, he asked the girl, "What's so interesting?" "I was just making you could swallow the yogurt." "Why?" Eric asked as a feeling of uneasiness came over him. "Well, that device constricting your vocal cords and voice box interferes with your swallowing. You can swallow soft foods, like yogurt, eggs and oatmeal, but with harder foods, you're going to have to take small bites. Just cut your food up the way you would for a small child and you'll be good to go." "Are you serious?" Eric asked in a high tone that bothered his ears. "Very serious, and it's all for the best." "How do you figure?" Eric asked in the deepest voice he found that he could muster. The girl replied, "Well, taking smaller bites will result in your stomach telling you that you're full faster. You will eat less and you will lose weight until your body reaches a plateau once it has become used to the decreased food intake." Eric glared at the girl as he replied, "I'm 5 feet 8 inches and only weigh 120 pounds. How much weight do I have to spare?" "A girl can always stand to lose 10 to 20 pounds, the girl replied with a smile before she opened the door and said, "It's time for your next treatment." Eric shook his head as he feared what the loss of weight would do to his body. He looked at her and responded, "Can't I at least have something to cover this up?" as he pointed at his body. "Oh, I'm sorry," the girl replied before she provided him with a hospital gown. Eric slipped it on and walked down the hallway with her before she brought him into a room where 2 other clients were undergoing treatments. Eric looked at the 2 feminized men who were having their hair worked on. The first man was having his hair dyed while the other was having the final extensions added to his hair. Eric was told to wait his turn and he sat down on a chair and waited for the stylist to call him over. When she did, Eric got to his feet and walked over to her. There was not a mirror in the room to his dismay as he sat down at the stylist's station. Eric was hoping to at least get a glimpse of himself. He could see how convincingly feminine the other men were and was anxious to see if he was as unambiguously feminine too. The stylists worked on Eric's hair as he wondered how he looked at that moment. He thought about what awaited him back home too. He feared that while he might look young enough to be in high school, he would be such an outsider that Bianca's plan would not work. He knew that she would be watching him as he walked the hallways of her school. He wondered what she would do if she thought he was intentionally failing to bond with the other girls. The stylist spent hours on his extensions before his hair was dyed. Eric hated the smell of the dye. He had always hated the smell from when he was young, when his mother would dye her hair in her eternal quest to keep looking young for the string of boyfriends she had after his father's death. When the stylist was finished dyeing his hair, Eric could see from the strands of hair that fell along the side of his face that she had dyed it strawberry blonde. He shook his head and knew that Bianca had to have had a hand in the color selection. Bianca always loved the hair color, but she felt that she could not pull off the hair color given the perpetually tanned skin she inherited from her Italian grandmother. The hair color, however, went well with Eric's light skin tone. I hope she's jealous when she sees me, Eric thought for a second before he chuckled to himself as he realized the ridiculous nature of his thought. Eric's smile faded as he was told to stand up by a clinic employee. The staff member directed Eric to his next destination. Eric got to his feet and followed the man's directions. He turned a corner and walked into a room and saw the beautician waiting for him. "Oh, there's my new canvas," she said with a smile. Eric forced a grin to his face as he walked towards her with his head down. The woman sat Eric down on a chair and began to thin out his eyebrows. The plucking did not hurt him all that much before she turned her attention to putting on his makeup. Eric listened to the woman as she explained the purpose of the various cosmetics she was applying to his face. She was careful to give him makeup tips and explained that he would be undergoing makeup training during his stay at the clinic. Eric responded to her praise for his appearance with polite thankfulness. The praise only made him wonder more and more about what he looked like. Eric then asked, "Can I get a mirror?" "A mirror?" The woman replied with a laugh before she said, "Soon enough. I'm not the one that gives our new creations a mirror to see themselves. That's left to our personal stylists." "When will I be seeing them?" "Right about now," she responded. Eric nodded as he looked up at the woman before he saw the door open. A young woman walked through the door and looked Eric over from head to toe as he sat in the beautician's chair. She nodded to herself and said, "I've got just the style in mind for you, young lady." Eric blushed while he got to his feet to follow her out the door. As he did so, he asked, "Could you please not call me young lady?" "What else would I call you then?" "How about Eric?" "Eric? That's no name for a pretty young girl." "Well, I'm not a pretty young girl." "Well, if you say so, but I sure won't be calling you Eric, Jasmine." "Jasmine?" "Yes, that's the name we have that was selected for you." "By who?" Eric said as his voice reached its highest pitch and irritated his ears as well as the personal stylists. "Your intake sheet doesn't say if it was by you or your companion." "You mean my wife? I don't think a woman your age can legally marry." "I'm 27 years old." "Not anymore, dear. You're definitely a minor, at least under the state's laws." "Oh, come on. We're not outside. Could you at least treat me like the man I am in here?" The girl laughed as she looked over Eric's body. She pointed at him and said, "What man is that?" "The man that has no body hair, the man that has such girlish twig legs, the man that has nothing pushing his hospital gown away from his body beneath his waist, the man that has something pushing his hospital gown away from his above his waist, the man who—" "Okay, I get it." "Good, girl," the girl responded as she pushed open a door and said, "Let's get you started." Eric watched as the girl went through the racks of clothes for ones in his size and said, "Since you're a teenager, we're going to have to dress you properly." "Okay," Eric replied slowly. "That means no stockings or petticoats or any other of those childish sissy fantasies you may have." "I'm not a sissy." "Of course not, you're a teenage girl and that's what you're going to dress like." "Great," Eric replied. The girl noticed his sarcasm and said, "Well, if you insist, we could get you some Lolita fashion." "I think you'd stick out like a sore thumb though." "No. That won't be necessary," Eric rushed to respond as he thought about the style of dress he was so enamored with during a trip to Japan a few years earlier. "Good, because I totally get a girly girl vibe from you, and I'd rather you fit in when you rock that look." "How old are you?" Eric asked. The girl smiled and said, "I'm 22. So, I'm not that far removed from standing in your shoes." Eric stared at the girl for a second before he asked, "Are you a former patient?" "Well, first off, we don't call our guests patients. We call them clients as we're not actually operating on them. Secondly, you wish you could look as good as me, babe. I'm all natural." Eric nodded, feeling slightly relieved that the picture of femininity in front of him dressed in shorts, pantyhose and 4-inch platform high heels that so aroused him was not a man. The girl then produced a slip-on, gray, high-waisted, bandage skirt, a layered white jersey tank top with a scoop neck and 3-inch heeled, silver fabric, peep-toed pumps. She smiled as she said, "This should get you started on the road to being the girl you've always wanted to be." "I never wanted to be a girl. I think it's time to drop the act, sister," the girl retorted as she handed him a white bra and a pair of gray tights and told him to put them on. Eric sighed as he took them from her. After removing his hospital dress, he first tried to put on the bra. He had seen girls do it a number of times before and figured that there was no real mystery to putting it on. He struggled to hook it behind his back while the girl smiled at his nude feminized body that he no longer felt the urge to cover himself up, as he knew that the exposed private parts were not really his anyway. The stylist continued to smile as she had seen countless men come through and struggle with their bras and never ask for help. She liked watching Eric struggle as his pride prevented him from asking the young girl for help dressing himself. After 10 minutes, Eric gave up and said, "You know what, I've decided to put on the pantyhose first." "Okay, but those are tights, not pantyhose. Is that a distinction without a difference?" "Not amongst girls it isn't." Eric shrugged and tried to put his feet into the tights, but the personal stylist stopped him. "What's the matter?" Eric asked. "You're going to put a run into them that way." "Well, what do I have to do?" "You have to roll them down to the bottom." "Like this," Eric said as he slowly rolled the tights down. "Like that," the girl said as she watched Eric. As he finished rolling them, she said, "Now take a seat over here and put your toes to the seam of each foot." Eric nodded and sat down on a stool in the room. He followed the personal stylist's direction and then slowly unrolled the tights up his leg as she instructed. Eric felt himself becoming aroused as the silky feeling of the tights ascended his legs. He was happy that his vagina form was keeping the young girl from noticing the pleasure he was taking in putting them on. As he finished pulling the tights up his legs, the girl handed Eric the bra back. Eric sighed and blushed as he asked, "Do you have any tips for this?" The girl nodded and instructed Eric how to hook the bra behind his back. Eric struggled to put her advice into practice, but after a few minutes, he found that he was able to. Eric then slipped the tank top overhead and stepped into the constricting skirt before he slid his feet into the heels. The girl smiled at Eric as she took him by the hand and led him out of the room. Eric felt uneasy walking in the heels with the tight-striped constricting skirt, but he felt slightly at ease because the personal stylist was dictating a slow pace as she guided him into a room that was mirrored on all 4 sides. Eric's jaw dropped as he moved his head around and saw his feminized body from all 4 sides. He turned and saw the personal stylist smile as she went close the door as she said, "I'm going to give you a moment to collect yourself, dear." Eric watched the door close and saw that it had mirror on the back of it too. Eric moved towards a corner and looked at how feminine his figure was. Everything about his appearance screamed girly girl, as the personal stylist had indicated. Eric examined his long strawberry blonde colored hair that was parted in the middle before he looked at his feminine face. There was nothing masculine about it. There was not a trace of the beard stubble he was used to sporting. There was nothing left of his eyebrows, but thin arches. The pink glossy lips seemed to be inviting a kiss he could never place on them. There were few traces of the face that he had been used to seeing in the mirror. The reshaping of his chin, however, had certainly feminized his face, as had the nose prosthesis. Eric felt that his nose was on the large size for a girl, but he knew he could not expect otherwise without undergoing a surgery. Still, the shape of the nose was feminine. He felt a bit self-conscious about it though, wondering if it was a bit bulbous. I'm sure the other girls will tease me for this, Eric thought to himself before he realized that he thought of himself as a girl. Eric shook his head, trying to disabuse himself of that notion. As he stared at the floor, he repeated to himself, no matter how much you may look like you're a girl, you're a guy, remember that. Eric took a deep breath and looked back into the mirror. He saw only a strange girl staring back at him. As Eric examined her face, he knew that she was definitely a teenager. I can't even buy a drink with this face, Eric muttered before he went back gazing at his feminine reflection. After a few minutes, the personal stylist knocked on the door and opened it. She smiled and asked, "How do you like the vanity room?" Eric stared at her and asked, "Is this real?" She smirked as she walked towards him and pinched his arm. Eric cringed as she replied, "Does it feel real?" Eric nodded as he stared back at the young girl's face in the mirror. Eric's stupor was ended when the stylist said, "Okay, stop admiring yourself, girly. It's time to get you some dinner and then I'm going to put you through your motions." "My what?" "Your motions, training, etc. I'm going to be the one who trains you over the next 2 weeks to be the type of girl who fits seamlessly with all the other teen girls you're going to be calling classmates soon enough." "You know about that?" Eric asked as he wondered what other information Bianca had given the clinic. "We know what we need to do to make sure that when you leave this place, no one will think that you're anything other than a regular teenage girl unless they knew the truth." Eric nodded and walked beside his personal trainer as she led him towards the cafeteria for dinner. Eric listened to her instructions as she told him to let the skirt constrict his stride and to carefully take each step. She smiled at his occasional stumbles and said, "Don't worry, it gets easier with practice." Eric nodded in response and hoped that she was right. When he got to the cafeteria, he was provided with a salad. Although he wanted to eat something with protein, he knew that his objections to the salad would get him nowhere. Eric ate beside the personal stylist in the cafeteria. She gave him advice regarding how he ate and how he sat. Eric was careful to observe her advice as he did not want anyone looking up his skirt. While Eric felt uncomfortable wearing such clothing, it was nothing in comparison to the feeling he got when he swallowed. Eric realized the technician was right. He found that he had to cut up his salad into very small bits before he chewed it. Despite feeling hungry when he entered the cafeteria, Eric only ate half his salad before he felt full. With his dinner finished, the personal stylist took Eric to the room he would be staying in during his time at the clinic. Eric looked around the room that was decorated with heart-shaped items. The word princess was printed above the bed that was covered with a pink bedspread on it. Eric felt that the room was too girlish. He stuck out his tongue as he looked at his accommodations, prompting the personal stylist to admonish him, "That's not ladylike. You're going to a proper private school, not a trashy public school where that kind of white trash behavior is tolerated." Eric nodded at her, knowing that his wife would probably admonish her student if she stuck out her tongue in disgust in her presence. The personal stylist felt that she had made her point when she picked up a 17 magazine and pointed to a stack of magazines as she said, "Take a look at these. I expect you to read each and every one of them while you're here. You're going to start with this one, and I'm going to quiz on teen culture each day to make sure you're doing your reading." "Okay," Eric replied as he looked at the television and wondered if there was a game on. The personal stylist smiled at Eric and said, "And don't waste your time watching television. The only channels you get in this room are MTV, MTV2 and the CW. Watching it will do you some good, but I don't want you to get jealous about other girls' super sweet 16s because you're not going to get one." Eric cursed under his breath as he realized that he had no male outlet in that room. He looked at the personal stylist and nodded to her before she left the room. Eric climbed into the bed and turned on the television to confirm what he had been told. When he found out that she had not been lying to him, he took to reading the 17 magazine she had provided him. The celebrity gossip in its pages bored him, but he made sure to memorize each detail before he looked at the other magazines in the pile that was left for him. Eric looked at each title with a feeling of sickness growing in his stomach. Glamour, Teen Vogue, allure? God! Why couldn't she have at least let me be a tomboy? Eric thought to himself as he rubbed his face. Eric cringed as he looked at the makeup that had rubbed off on his hands. Eric walked into the bathroom that was part of his accommodations and washed his hands. He saw makeup remover on the sink top and began to apply it to his face as he had seen Bianca do to hers each day before bed. When he was satisfied that it was off, Eric walked back into the bedroom section of his room and looked for a change of clothes. He found a few pairs of girls' pajamas and he put on the least girly pair he was provided with, which consisted of a neon pink V-neck t-shirt and leopard pants with a pink belted waist. After Eric dressed in the pajamas, he headed to the bathroom again. He went to lift the seat on the toilet, but he found that it would not budge. He cursed himself for a moment before he realized that there was a reason it could not be pulled up. Eric sighed as he sat down and went to the bathroom, feeling more feminine than he had since he left the mirrored room. Eric wiped himself dry as Bianca had done in his presence before. Eric then walked over to his bed and slipped under the covers. He read another magazine with the light on before he turned it off and turned in for the night. Eric spent the next 2 weeks going through a feminine boot camp. He was put through the rigors of learning to walk in heels, sit like a woman, use his hands like a woman and increase his voice inflection like a woman as well. The clinic focused on every detail to try to get Eric to conduct himself unambiguously like a teenage girl. Eric feared that the training would affect him even after his prosthetics were removed and he was a man again, but he knew that those fears were premature at best. Eric found that the training took up most of his days, and he had to laugh at the basic training like walking with a book on his head to keep his straight and his chin up. It all felt ridiculous to him, but he worked on it as hard as he could for fear of Bianca finding out that he was not trying his best. In addition to training him to act like a woman, Eric found that his personal stylist was actually going to quiz him on popular culture. Every day he had to read several entertainment, style, and women's magazines, and he was tested for his retention of it each day. His personal stylist would hold up pictures of various celebrities, and he was required to repeat the lines he was told were his opinions of each of them. As his personal stylist picked up a picture of Justin Bieber, Eric said, "That's Justin. He's so hot. I'm so going to be Mrs. Bieber. He can do so much better than that skank Selena." As his personal stylist nodded, she picked up a picture of Taylor Lautner, prompting Eric to say, "He's so cute and that body, OMG. He's so much hotter than Count Fagula." Satisfied with his answer, the stylist continued with other celebrities' pictures. Eric found that he was frequently praising the male celebrities while he was finding the slightest faults with female celebrities to tear them down. Eric did not understand why he was being trained that way, but he figured that there had to be a reason. Eric spent his time alone in his room getting caught up on his reading and Teen Mom and various other reality shows on MTV. While Eric felt that everything he was learning was useless information, he felt better about learning it since he knew it would make it easier for him to fit in at school. As Eric's departure date arrived, he felt uneasy. He wondered what Bianca would think of when she saw his feminized appearance. Even though she was the reason he looked the way he did, he wondered if she could ever think of him as a man again once she saw him looking so much like one of the students at her school. Thoughts about her reaction to his feminized appearance had kept creeping into his mind whenever he had a moment to himself in the clinic. It was her opinion that meant the most to him given the power that she wielded over his life. Eric waited for Bianca in the lobby near the check-in desk. Every time the door drew open, his head perked up and stared at the face of the person who entered until it was Bianca. Bianca walked into the room and did not look twice at Eric before she walked over to the employee at the check-in counter and told her why she was there. Bianca's actions made him nervous as he thought, "She didn't recognize me?" Given Bianca's failure to recognize him, Eric wondered if she would be displeased with how he turned out. Still, a part of him wondered if it was actually the point. He felt a bit relieved that even his own wife could not recognize who he really was. Eric got to his feet and approached his wife as the employee pointed Bianca towards him. Bianca smirked as she saw the uneasy teenage girl walking towards her dressed in a sleeveless, teal and black snakeskin print blouse with an asymmetrical silhouette, black leggings and black wedges with a 4-inch heel, an open toe and a crisscross vamp. Bianca cupped her hands and covered her mouth to stifle herself as he approached her, looking so similar to the students that approached her after being caught doing something wrong at school. She could tell that Eric had no confidence at that moment. The only thing that mattered to him was how she was going to respond. Bianca lowered her hands and said, "Well, Jasmine, I have to say I'm surprised with how pretty you turned out to be." "Thanks," Eric replied, blushing at her praise. "You're positively adorable," Bianca added. Eric continued to blush as he nodded at his wife's continued praise for his feminized appearance. "Are you ready to come home?" Bianca asked, already knowing the answer. Eric nodded and Bianca headed for the door. They walked out of the lobby and headed towards the front door where the doorman let them out. They walked down the street to where Bianca's car was parked and got inside without saying a word to one another. Eric felt uncomfortable as he wanted Bianca to indicate how she was going to treat them in their private moments. As Bianca started the car, she turned to Eric and said, "I hope the clinic got you good and ready to be one of the girls at my school." "I'm sure they did," Eric replied as Bianca pulled out of the parking spot. Bianca turned her head before the car came to a stop as she stared at him as she processed his high voice. Eric had only said one word to her in the clinic and she had not noticed the tone of his voice at that time. As she went to respond, the car jerked forward. Bianca turned and stared into the rear-view mirror at the car that had slammed into her car at a low rate of speed as she let her car sit idle in the middle of the street. The middle-aged man jumped out of the car and went to shout at her before he noticed Bianca's pretty face. The man was still angry, but Bianca explained that he had rear-ended her, which was meant that the accident report would find him fully at fault. The man understood the position he was in as Bianca got out of the car. Eric followed her out to survey the damage to the vehicles. There was nothing more than a few surface scratches. The other driver leered at Bianca's slender legs that peeked out from beneath her white dress as well as her figure that the V-neck, slim fit, cross-front dress hugged. Eric wanted to shout at him for doing so in front of him, but he knew that the man assumed that he was nothing more than his wife's daughter at that moment. Bianca and the other driver decided to not get the cops involved and each got back into their cars. Bianca started down the street and said to Eric, "I can't believe that voice." "I know. I was shocked at first. How did they even do it? They explained it to me, but I didn't understand it." Bianca nodded as she replied, "Well, at least we know your voice won't be giving you away." Eric blushed as he tilted his head and nodded. He knew that there was nothing ambiguous about his voice or any part of his appearance. He figured that his voice alone would cover up any masculine traits that might bleed through his disguise as he tried to act like a normal teenage girl around his soon-to-be classmates. As they continued on their way back to their home, Bianca explained what he would experience at school among the girls. Eric nodded and tried to take careful note of what his wife thought would happen to him at school. Eric smiled as they turned down his block. They pulled up in front of the home and Bianca walked towards the front door. Eric looked around the front of the house for his car and asked, "Bianca, where's my car?" Bianca did not answer as she walked inside her home. Eric followed her in and saw her pick up the phone. Eric went to ask the question again, but Bianca put up her index finger as she said, "Hello, Willow." "Yes, we're back home. Can you come on over?" "Great." Eric stared at his wife as he wondered why Willow was coming over to see them. He then repeated his question to her. Bianca looked at him oddly and said, "You're too young to have a car, Jasmine." "Stop with the games," Eric replied. "I don't know what you're talking about, Jasmine, and if you speak to me with that tone at school, you're going to be in big trouble. Do you understand?" Eric nodded as he put his head down and asked, "What happened to Eric's car?" Bianca smiled at Eric's submission to her insistence that he divorce his current feminized self from her husband. She sat down on a chair next to the island in her kitchen as she responded, "Eric's car has been put in storage until he gets back, as were all his belongings." "What are you putting him out of sight and out of mind?" Eric asked, clearly aggravated by his wife's actions. Bianca noticed his peeved tone and said, "You're exactly right. When he comes back, we'll put everything into place. Bring his stuff back, apply for a replacement license." Replacement license? Eric interjected. Of course. I cut it up the moment he left. I didn't want anyone trying to use it to impersonate my Eric. Eric glared at her for a moment. Bianca met his gaze and stared him down. Eric squirmed uncomfortably in front of her as he often did when he made her angry. Bianca turned her head away from him as she heard a knock on the front door. She shouted, "Come in." Willow walked through the door and smiled as she saw Eric standing with his back towards her. She saw his long lean legs and slender figure and said, "Oh, what a cute exchange student." Eric turned his head towards her as she realized that she was playing along with his wife's charade. Willow started to laugh as she saw Eric's feminized face. "What's so funny?" Eric shrieked in his high voice that only made Willow laugh harder. Willow collected herself as she replied, "I think you look and sound more like a girl than I did at your age." Eric shook his head at her, but he knew that she was right about the voice as Willow's voice was more gravelly than most women's. Willow smiled as she turned to Bianca and said, "So is our little exchange student ready to see her room?" Eric looked at her oddly before he turned to Bianca, who said, "I'm sure she'd love to. Come along, Jasmine. We'll get you all set up." "What are you talking about?" Eric asked as Willow walked towards the front door. "Your room. You're staying with us," Willow replied. Eric stared back at his wife for confirmation. Bianca nodded before Eric shouted, "Are you serious?" Of course, Jasmine White was signed up at my school with Willow's address. It was very gracious of her to take you in. "Are you crazy?" Eric shouted in response to his wife. "No, she's your legal guardian," Bianca replied. "I'm not doing it. You can't make me." Willow smirked as she noticed how much Eric sounded like a typical petulant teenage girl. Bianca countered, "You will, or you'll be spending the rest of your life as Jasmine." Eric froze before he shouted, "You wouldn't." "I would. I won't have a layabout around the home. This is for your own good so that the next time you get a job you'll actually be good at it. We've been over this before." "I know, but..." Eric began to respond before Bianca continued, "I also be damned if you're going to back out of this now that it's all official. I'm not going to have Willow arrested for having a truant child in her ward either." Eric nodded before he replied, "But that doesn't mean I have to stay with her?" "Well, where did you think you were going to stay?" Bianca asked as she put her hands on her hips and stood up. "Here," Eric shouted as he threw up his hands. "Dear, we couldn't do that. It would be scandalous to have a headmistress sharing her home with an unrelated student." "We're not unrelated." "Oh, we are, dear," Bianca countered in a calm tone as she stared down at her husband. Eric knew that his wife was right regarding the reasons he had to stay with Willow, but he did not like anything about it. He put his head down and asked Willow, "Where will I be staying?" "We have a guest room. It's all set up for you. My kids know that you're over here and are anxious to meet you. My little Alice is so excited to have another girl in the house. She just loves your name too. She's a big Snow White and Aladdin fan, so when I told her that was your name she was really excited." Eric turned to Bianca and asked, "Did you base my name on a 6-year-old's taste in movies?" Bianca laughed as she replied, "It seemed like the thing to do." "It sounds like a stripper's name," Eric countered. "Please don't mention strippers in front of my kids," Willow interjected. Eric nodded as he continued to follow Willow towards the door. He looked back at his wife one last time, hoping she would give him a reprieve before he followed Willow out the front door. He sighed as he saw Bianca wave goodbye to him. Eric walked next door with Willow. As Eric walked into the home, he heard a stirring. He saw Alice running towards the front door to greet him. Eric said hello to her as she acted giddily around him and asked him if he wanted to play with her. Eric replied, "Maybe later." Willow then added that Eric had to get situated in the home before he could do anything else. Eric was then introduced to Adam, Willow's 13-year-old son. Adam turned away from the television and his eyes opened wide as he looked at Eric. Eric squirmed uncomfortably as he saw the lusty looks that Adam was giving him. Adam got to his feet and introduced himself. Willow could see that her son was attracted to Eric before she replied, "Calm down, dear. She's too old to be hanging around with a boy that still collects comic books." "Mom!" Adam shouted before Eric smiled and walked away from him. Willow led him up the stairs and showed him to the guest room. The room was painted with white walls and had oak-colored furniture in it. There was a daybed with a white comforter decorated with a floral print. The walls were decorated with reproductions of paintings. Eric felt relieved that the room was not nearly as girlish as he feared it would be. It was a normal room, decorated with a woman's touch not unlike the bedroom he shared with Bianca. There was a television in the corner of the room facing the daybed, which made Eric feel a little relieved as he knew that he was going to have some escape from his new reality. After looking around his room for a few minutes, Eric walked down the stairs and had lunch with Willow and Alice as Adam left the home to go hang out with some of his friends on the last day before the new school year began. Eric smiled at Alice's constant questioning of him. She was intrigued by him and kept following him around all afternoon until he was able to use the excuse of his travel as the reason he was tired. Eric walked up to his bedroom and closed the door behind him. He turned towards the closet to see what Bianca had gotten for him while he was away. The clothing looked like that of a normal teenage girl except for the uniforms that he was so accustomed to seeing when he visited his wife at her school. Eric frowned at the plaid-skirted uniform. There were only 2 types of uniforms and he had several pairs of both. Eric looked over the familiar plaid skirt, gray sweater vest and white blouse uniform and the plaid jumper and white blouse uniforms with a sense of dread about his first day of secondary school as a female student. Eric awoke the next morning and got ready for school. He ate and showered before he dressed in the academy's skirted uniform. Eric believed that the jumper was too childish and felt demeaned by the prospect of wearing it, even though he knew it was simply a matter of time before he would be compelled to wear it to school. After he put on a pair of socks and the uniform's required plain black shoes, he headed towards the vanity in his room. He placed on his makeup as he was trained to do at the clinic. Once he finished with his makeup, Eric headed down the stairs and picked up the backpack that Bianca had purchased for him. Eric talked with Willow for a second before she told him that he had to get going to catch his bus. Eric nodded and headed out the door to the bus stop. Eric felt relieved as he stood alone waiting for the bus. Eric was glad that he was the only student from the academy on the street. Eric's sense of relief turned to a sense of dread as the yellow bus came into view. Eric knew that there was no escaping what he was about to go through. The bus came to a stop as its brakes let out a squealing sound. The driver opened the bus's door to let Eric in. Eric smiled at the driver for a second as he walked up the steps. As he reached the top step, he saw the other girls from the school on the bus. They stared at him as he walked down the aisle of the bus. Eric could tell that each one of the girls was sizing him up as a new girl in the school. Eric felt weak as he walked past their inquisitive eyes. He saw girls whispering to each other and laughing and was sure that it was at his expense. Eric sat down in the first vacant seat and stared out the window, hoping that everyone would leave him alone. As the bus started down the road, 2 girls walked over to him and sat across from him on the other side of the aisle, while the girl sitting in front of him turned around and peeked her head over the back of the seat and introduced herself as Courtney. Eric introduced himself as Jasmine White before the 2 girls sitting across the aisle introduced themselves to Eric as Terry and Bridget. The girls inquired about who Eric was. Eric gave them the backstory that he was told by Willow and Bianca. Eric explained that he was an exchange student that had come from Vancouver and was staying with Willow Potts, an alum of the academy. Eric kept talking with the girls as the bus continued on its way to the school. Eric knew that the girls were continuing to form their impression of him and he tried his best to impress them. He went out of his way to compliment Terry's silver metallic headband as well as the spiral striped pattern tights that Courtney was wearing beneath her jumper. Eric knew that both girls were expressing as much individuality in their clothing as the academy's rules allowed. Eric got off the bus and asked the girls where his homeroom was as he told them the number. Bridget nodded and told her that she was in the same homeroom and would lead the way. Eric said goodbye to Terry and Courtney as he followed Bridget to his homeroom. Eric and Bridget were then seated on opposite sides of the homeroom by the instructor, who sat the students alphabetically by their last names. The instructor welcomed the class to another year of schooling, which was met by vacant stares as some of the girls tried to hide the cell phones they were texting on under their desks. Eric looked around the homeroom after the instructor stopped speaking and saw that most of the girls were sneaking looks at him. Eric felt like he was an animal on display at a zoo or a sideshow attraction. Being the new girl was exposing him to a large amount of scrutiny from his fellow students. As homeroom ended, Eric got to his feet without any of the girls saying a word to him and headed to his first period classroom, which he had noticed passing on his way to the homeroom. Eric scurried to the room trying to avoid small talk with any of the girls. He felt that he would be better of observing them than interacting with them. Eric sat down in the science classroom and wondered what the class was about. His schedule was written in generalities dictating the class names in the broadest possible terms: science, first period, math second period, English, third period. He had no idea as to what he was actually going to be taught. As the instructor entered the room, she gave a roll call and seated the girls alphabetically so that she could learn her students' names quicker. As the instructor began to describe the class, Eric realized that he was in a biology class, which was a sophomore class in the academy. Eric assumed that he was being sent to school as a senior. Eric raised his hand and said, "Miss Carpenter, I don't believe I belong in this class." "Okay, miss, let's see, Miss White, it says that you're supposed to be here, so you're where you're supposed to be." Eric heard the other girls snickering around him and put his head down as the instructor continued to describe the curriculum they were going to be learning throughout the year. After the first period ended, Eric headed to the headmistress's office and asked to see her about her schedule. The headmistress's secretary tried to dismiss Eric, but Eric demanded to see her. Bianca heard Eric's appeal and came out from her office and let Eric inside to speak with her. "What can I do for you, Jasmine?" Bianca said with a smile. Eric pointed at his schedule and said, "What's the meaning of this? You signed me up as a sophomore?" "Well, that's what your transcript says you are," Bianca countered. "You invented my transcript," Eric responded in a low voice. "Why are you so upset? Why can't I be an upperclassman? What difference does it make? Will taking be your first time through with them?" "No." "So you're repeating classes you've already taken regardless?" "Yes, but..." "But what? Is there something more dignified about being a senior? I mean, come on, Jasmine. Most of your classes have been with underclassmen before. That's where you'll start at with your new job. It seems to me that the best way to understand them is to be among them, not above them." Eric muttered and shook his head before Bianca continued, "Now, run along and get a hall pass from my secretary. You're already late to your math class, and I don't think you want to get detention on your first day here. Okay?" Eric shook his head and huffed as he got to his feet. Eric understood his wife's reasoning, even though he was not happy about it. Eric also realized that he was not in any position to fight against it. He could not change his transcript and knew that it was the best for everyone if he simply accepted that he was going to be spending the next few months as a 15-year-old girl. Eric got a hall pass from Bianca's secretary and hurried down the hallway to his next classroom. The instructor shook her head at Eric as he gave her the hall pass and took a seat that was left open for him. Eric felt bored as he listened to the woman introduce the class to their subject matter before she gave a brief lesson. Eric stared vacantly at her as she explained the mathematical equation on the board that Eric was intimately familiar with. Eric felt frustrated listening to the instructor provide information that he already knew. The next class was not any easier for Eric. Eric looked at the English curriculum he was provided with on a sheet and recognized each of the books. He had read all but one of them as a high school student, and the new book was nothing more than a feminine fluff piece. Eric's fourth period class was a gym class. He smiled as he saw Bridget walk into the gym with Terry by her side. They said hello to Eric and sat together on the bleachers as the gym teacher sat at a table set up in the front of the room. Eric looked at Bridget and asked, "Do you know anything about Miss Lynn?" Bridget looked at Terry, smiled before she said, "Everybody here knows something about Miss Lynn. She's the school's cheerleading coach." "The gym teacher is the cheerleading coach? It's our most decorated sport. We've won a lot of championships." She was actually the head cheerleader on a national champion squad in high school, and she was on a national champion college squad too. "You don't want to cross her though," Terry added. "Why not? She's mean and controlling when she doesn't get what she wants. The headmistress puts up with her because she's good for the academy's reputation. Miss Lynn has gotten a lot of scholarships for her girls here." Their conversation ended when Miss Lynn called for the class's attention. She assigned the girls' gym lockers and made them sign in their names and their lock numbers before the girls got to take a seat. Miss Lynn then looked over Eric as the girls around him began to talk amongst themselves as they waited for the class to end. Miss Lynn called out, "Jasmine White, please come up here." Eric looked at Bridget and Terry as he got to his feet. They gave him blank looks as they did not know why Miss Lynn was calling him to the front of the room. Miss Lynn looked over Eric's body and said, "You're new here. You didn't have a chance to try out for any of our team sports." "That's all right. I'm not really interested in any of them." "Why, with those legs, I figure you might be quick. You might be a great soccer or field hockey player." "Sports are not really my thing," Eric replied as he pulled at the hem of his skirt. "Well, regardless. It's my job as an educator to put you in the best possible situation when you leave this school." "I'm sure it is," Eric replied. "That's why I'm sure that you can respect the fact that your dislike of sports is of no concern to me. If I think you're going to be good at something, you're going to be trying out for the team to replace one of the weaker girls who doesn't have a chance at a scholarship." Eric stared at Miss Lynn with a dumbfounded expression as he listened to her forceful tone. Eric could tell that Miss Lynn was the kind of woman that refused to take no for an answer. She seemed even more forceful and dominant than his wife. Miss Lynn called forward 3 girls from the bleachers. Each was a member of one of the school's teams. She asked Eric to compete against the 3 of them. Eric politely refused before Miss Lynn nodded to the girl from the soccer to kick the ball at him. Eric jerked his body and caught the ball. He then threw the ball across the gym in a fit of anger. Miss Lynn smirked at him as she was surprised by how far he could throw the ball. She instructed the girl from the cheerleading squad to jump into Eric's arm. Eric caught the girl and tried to peel her off his body, but the girl pushed herself up. Eric found himself holding the diminutive girl partially over his head. The ease with which Eric held the girl up prompted Miss Lynn to tell the girl to get down. Miss Lynn smiled at Eric and said, "That's very impressive, Jasmine." "What? You're unusually strong. I like that in my girls." "Thanks," Eric said as he blushed. "No, don't be embarrassed. It's a great trait. I will really make good use of you." "That's not necessary," Eric replied in a low voice. Miss Lynn stared Eric in the eyes and said, "You're on my squad." "No, I'm not really interested. That's not my problem. I expect to see you at practice first thing after school. But I don't have any cheerleading experience. We don't need you for the precision stuff. We need you more for the strength. Don't worry, I'll get you up to speed before the tournaments start." "Thank you, but I'm not going to." "You're not going to what?" Miss Lynn shouted as she moved closer to him. Eric felt oddly intimidated by the smaller woman whom he knew was no match for his strength. He shook his head and replied in meek voice, "I'm not going to do it." "What good reason do you have to say no?" Eric stammered as he tried to think of a reason as Bianca walked into the gym. Miss Lynn smiled as she turned to Bianca and said, "Oh, headmistress. Have you met Miss White?" "Yes, I have met Jasmine." "Really? Well, that's great. You know, Jasmine just showed us that she's a very strong girl." "I bet she is." "I bet she is," Bianca said as she shook her head a little at her husband. "Her frame is very misleading." "That's great. She's perfect for cheerleading, lean, explosive and powerful." "Oh, she's joining the cheer squad, is she?" Bianca asked, a bit surprised. "Yes, she is." Bianca turned towards Eric for confirmation. "No, I'm not. I just don't think I can do it." "Well, what do you think, Miss Lynn?" Bianca asked. "That's nonsense. Of course she can." "Well, then it's settled. She's on the team." "What?" Eric shrieked in a voice that made some of the girls in the classroom laugh. Bianca explained, "Jasmine, here at the academy, we believe that it's best to push girls out their shells and into situations where they can excel even when it's not something that they would ever do willingly." Eric shook his head before Bianca departed and Eric was sent back to the bleachers by Miss Lynn. Eric sat down with Bridget and Terry and said, "What the hell? I told you she always gets what she wants," Bridget replied. Eric shook his head as the bell rang. He followed Terry to their next class, which was a health class. Eric sat through the lecture and addressed the teacher that was right out of college by her last name. While the other instructors were older than Eric, the health instructor was a few years younger than him. He felt demeaned by having to call her by her last name, but he knew that he did not any choice given his appearance. Eric then headed to his lunch period. As he walked into the lunchroom alone, Eric realized that he did not know any of the girls there. Eric got a plate and sat down at a table by himself as he heard others talking around him, including some he could tell were making fun of him given his isolated status at that moment. Eric knew that being outside of a clique made him an easy target. Eric was well aware that solitary figures are the easiest to mock because they don't have friends to buffer and guard against the verbal abuse. Eric continued on to his next class and finished off his school day before he was required to report to cheerleading practice. He was fitted for a uniform before he came out and met the squad. Eric was introduced to each of the girls before he was brought out a pair of sneakers. Eric slipped his feet into them as Miss Lynn told him that he was expected to wear a pair of shorts, a loose skirt or pants to each practice starting the next day. Eric nodded and thought about the gym clothes that Bianca had bought for him and knew that he would be wearing them far more than he anticipated. The practice then began and Eric was required to repeat his feats of strength with the girls. He lifted up the smaller girls with considerably less difficulty than the other female spotters. He joined with the other girls to flip the smaller girls in air and catch them. As they landed in his arms and hands, Eric felt disgusted by having his hands on the young students. The part of him that knew that he was an adult was disgusted by the inappropriateness of his touching them, even while the girls around him thought nothing of it as they believed that he was a normal teenage girl like them. Eric felt relieved as the practice came to an end, and he went home on the late bus with several of the other girls from the squad and the other sport teams. Eric watched as the girls from each team congregated together on the bus as did the girls from the cheer squad. Eric tried to segregate himself from his fellow cheerleaders, trying to not get engrossed in their conversations and only interacting with them when he was specifically addressed until he got off at his stop. As he walked through the door, Willow asked about his day and Eric explained his forced inclusion on the cheerleading squad. Alice perked up when she heard that Eric was now on the cheerleading squad. She ran over and asked many questions as he joined Willow in the kitchen to help finish making dinner before they ate together. Adam rolled his eyes at Alice's constant questing of Eric about every detail of his practice and his day in high school. After cleaning up after dinner, Eric headed upstairs to his room to do his homework. As he began writing out his answers to his math homework, Eric felt increasingly despondent about the situation he found himself trapped in. Eric went to school the next morning, desperately seeking a way out of the youthful feminine prison his wife had created for him. Eric went through his classes as he had the day before, trying to fit in even as he kept racking his mind to think of some way to get his wife to send him back to the clinic early. The school day ended, and he reported to cheerleading practice as he was required to. Miss Lin watched him working with some of the other girls she considered less than stellar when it came to their dance moves as they prepared for their first dance class before practice. While Eric was recruited for his strength, Miss Lin still determined that he had to work on his limberness and precision movements. Eric was called over by Miss Lin along with 2 other girls who were used to throw the lighter, more agile girls in the air. Miss Lin looked at them as she said, "Girls, you're going to be sent for extra dance lessons." Eric closed his eyes as he heard her words. He had yet to even attend a dance class with the other girls on the squad, but he had already found out that he was going to spending more time outside of the sanctuary of his room in Willow's home. Miss Lin then called for the girls' attention and began to go through her normal instructions at the start of class. The girls began by stretching as they always did. Eric had a hard time trying to avoid staring at the stretching girls in front of him. He knew that it was wrong to look at them given how old he really was, and he tried his best to keep that fact in mind. Once the girls finished stretching, Miss Lin began to put them through their paces. Eric quickly became embarrassed by Miss Lin's constant scolding of him for his lack of rhythmic abilities. It did not help his case when he informed her that he did not have a background in dance. Miss Lin stared at him and knew that she would have to pay special attention to Eric to make sure that he progressed with his dancing. Eric struggled to try to keep up with the jazz routines the girls were dancing pursuant to Miss Lin's instructions. As Eric practiced a jazz contraction with his arms to his side and his hands held out flat to the side, he noticed that Bianca had entered the gym. He quickly straightened up his torso and began trying to emulate the girl standing in front of him as she danced to the music. Bianca smirked at Eric, who blushed as she watched him dancing with the other cheerleaders. Miss Lin walked over and spoke with Bianca about Eric's progress. Eric tried not to listen to their conversation as he continued dancing by trying to follow the lead of the girl in front of him. Bianca stood in front of the class and watched Miss Lin lead the practice, which made the girls in the class all nervous. They all feared their headmistress and wondered if she had an ulterior motive for being there. Eric noticed that they were all sneaking sheepish looks at her just like he was. Eric smiled for a moment as he wondered what they would think if they realized why she was really there. Bianca smirked at Eric's ungraceful dance moves as Miss Lin continued to shout about what he was doing wrong until Bianca started to laugh and headed for the door. As Bianca walked out of the room, Eric let out a sigh of relief before he turned his full attention back to the dance routine he was trying to master. He moved along with the other girls. He then went to jump and landed awkwardly. He fell towards the wall and chipped a tooth. The practice came to a halt as Miss Lin ran towards a phone to find the student emergency contact directory to call Willow. Willow rushed down to the school and picked Eric up to take him to a dentist. Eric felt embarrassed as everyone watched him leave the practice early because of his clumsiness. Eric was taken to the dentist, who quickly noted his overbite. Eric had always had an overbite. His mother had not had adequate dental insurance or the money to get him braces as a child. Willow noted that he had dental insurance as Jasmine White, causing him to groan as the dentist gave her the name of an orthodontist to get him checked out. Eric shook his head as he left the dentist office and was taken to the orthodontist, who had managed to fit him in at the end of the day. Eric sat down in the orthodontist office and looked around at the kids, who were all younger than he appeared and already had braces. He read the periodicals in the waiting room as he waited the 2 hours before he was taken in to be seen. The orthodontist confirmed the dentist's opinion of Eric's overbite and recommended braces. Eric listened in silence as he was scheduled to come back to get them put on. Eric sulked as he walked out of the orthodontist's office. Eric tried to not think about getting braces as he was taken back to Willow's home. When he got there, he helped her make dinner as Adam sat on the couch and Alice scurried around the home and periodically peppered him with questions. As they began to eat dinner together, Alice asked about his day. Eric noted that he would be getting braces and had suffered an accident at his dance class. Eric's mentioning of the dance practice prompted Alice's eyes to open wide. She kept asking him more questions about it and noted that she took jazz lessons. She then mentioned her tap and ballet lessons and asked Eric if he ever took them. Eric said that he did not, but that the team was going to be given tap lessons by Miss Lin as part of their training to help improve their rhythm and precision movements. "What about ballet?" Alice asked. Eric shook his head as he took another bite of his food. "Wouldn't it help you dance better?" Alice asked. "I guess," Eric replied. "Mommy, can Jasmine take ballet with me?" Eric's head jerked towards Alice before he stared up at Willow. Willow saw the alarm on his face before she replied, "I don't know if Madam Matthews would like a girl Jasmine's age in a class with girls your age. But she hasn't taken ballet, we're probably better." "That's true, dear, but Jasmine would look out of place and might be uncomfortable." Alice nodded as she said, "But shouldn't you ask her coach if she should do it? If she dances with me she might be a better cheerleader." Willow nodded and said, "I'll give her a call after dinner." Eric hoped that she was joking, but once they finished dinner, Willow asked Eric to clean up the plates. He had no problem doing so. He did it for Bianca all the time, and that was probably something that had been relayed to Willow by his wife. As he began to clean the plates, he saw Willow dialing the phone. He shuddered as he heard her speaking with Miss Lin. He knew that Miss Lin would have no problem with him taking extra dance lessons and would probably be enthusiastic about the possibility. His beliefs were quickly confirmed by Willow before she called Alice's dance instructor, Madam Wendy Matthews. Eric listened closely as Willow explained the situation to Madam Matthews. Willow smirked at Eric as Madam Matthews accepted Eric into the class because she had no beginner's class for adults. Willow hung up the phone and stared at Eric. Eric put his head down as he knew what Willow was about to tell him. As he heard the news, Eric nodded solemnly as he put the last dish into the rack to dry. Willow then told him, "You make sure that you thank Madam Matthews for letting you in. She's doing this as a favor to me. She was a friend of mine growing up and she was actually on the cheerleading squad that won the state championship with Miss Lin." Eric stared at Willow and realized that he might have ended up dancing with Madam Matthews anyway if Miss Lin had determined it was necessary, as she likely would, since he was by far the least talented dancer on the cheer squad. As Willow left the room, Alice ran up to him and said, "Don't worry, Jasmine. Madam Matthews isn't that mean. She'll make you a great dancer like me." Eric smiled and nodded at Alice's beaming face as he felt sickened by the thought that crept into his head. "When I walk into that studio, I won't be a full-grown man or even a teenage girl. She's going to treat me like a 6-year-old. Eric shuddered for a moment before Alice grabbed his hand and asked him to brush her hair. The next morning, Eric awoke and headed to the orthodontist instead of school. He felt uneasy and uncomfortable as his mouth felt increasingly dry as the braces were painstakingly affixed to his teeth. Eric wondered if they would make him look hideous. There were other girls on the team who had braces, and they were all self-conscious about their smiles and could not wait to get their braces off. After the orthodontist finished putting the braces on his teeth, Willow was brought into the room. She smiled down at Eric as he sat up and followed her out the door. Eric hurried towards the car and got inside it. He peered into the rear-view mirror to check out his appearance and shuddered as she saw the neon pink braces affixed to his teeth. "Are you ready to go to school? Why did you get me the pink braces?" Eric whined in a high lisping voice. "They're the least ugly type," Willow countered before she drove Eric to his school. After they pulled, Willow signed him into school late. Bianca noticed and came over to see them. "So how do you like your new braces?" Bianca asked. "They're okay, I guess," Eric said, unable to meet his wife's gaze as he winced at his lisping voice. Bianca smiled at him and said, "Open up and let me see them." Eric stared at her in silence before Bianca glared at him. Eric swallowed hard and forced a smile onto his face. "Oh, pretty in pink. I like them." "Thanks," Eric said while he blushed. Bianca smiled at Eric and said, "Now, get to class. You don't want to miss any more than you have already." Eric nodded and turned away from her. He blushed as he hurried away from his wife. He rushed down the hallway towards his locker to grab his books before he headed to class. As Eric's first week as Jasmine continued, he found himself anxiously awaiting the weekend. He longed to be away from the teenage girls who were constantly surrounding him. He wanted a chance to be treated like he was not one of them. He wanted to be apart from them. He could never remember wanting anything more than to be treated like an adult, but he knew that there was not a chance of that happening. Still, the chance to spend more time alone in his room would be a welcome respite from the deluge of femininity that surrounded him every weekday. The insidiousness of the gossip that spread around the school about the exploits of the various girls and the sharing of news about celebrities and their crushes made him want to cry. It all seemed so shallow to him, like the petty jealousies that the girls he was spending time with had with one another. Eric tried to fly under the radar. He did not freely associate with any of the girls from his school, and very few of them paid him any attention except for his fellow cheerleaders and the girls on his bus. The other cheerleaders made sure that Eric was included in their activities around the school since Miss Lynn instructed them to make him feel welcome. Eric was always on the periphery of it all though. He listened to them complain about one another when the others' backs were turned. Eric often found himself wondering what they were saying behind his back given his standoffish behavior around them. Do they think I am a bitch or a snob? Eric found himself thinking as the girls around him kept up with their character assassinations of the other girls on the squad and in the school. Eric complained about it to Willow, who explained that it was just the way that women were around each other. Willow laughed as she said, "A woman who thinks that men are the ones that are keeping her down is usually delusional. No one undercuts girls more than other girls." Eric nodded as he began to realize that the teenage girls were not the one-dimensional cell phone-addicted Facebook junkies he assumed them to be. The sheer amount of politics required for a teenage girl to successfully maintain her image stunned him. If they only put this much effort into their studies, they might actually make something of themselves, Eric found himself thinking as another B- student among the cheerleaders spread rumors about the sexual orientation of the girl that had spread rumors about her sexual activity. The infighting carried over to the practices, and Eric noticed that some of the girls catching the girls they threw up in the air were making sure to elbow those girls as they hoisted them up. Miss Lynn would admonish it when she noticed, but she largely accepted it as normal behavior among the girls. As Eric finally did things right at the practices, he found that the other girls were taking the credit for it. Eric was upset by it, but he could not sell himself as effectively as the other cheerleaders could. The only moment of pride Eric had was when he improved enough with his dance steps to earn praise from Miss Lynn. While he was still the worst dancer, she was impressed by how quickly he advanced. His improvement was largely the result of him doubling down on practice at home in the privacy of his own room. He wanted to improve so that he would stop getting looks from the other girls from his ungainly movements. He wanted to fit in and not draw attention to himself. While this had never been important to him when he was a teenage boy, Eric found that it was now that he was reading the girls making fun of him about it on their Facebook pages. The cutting anonymous words spread about his sexuality, talent, and appearance made him sick to his stomach. Eric could not understand why he found himself caring so much about what the girls on his cheerleading squad thought about him. Eric tried to improve his standing with them by trying to go out with them after school, but like many of the other girls, his guardian would not let him go out on school nights. The girls whose parents granted them more independence made fun of him and the other girls who were kept cosset in their homes after dinner. Eric's attempts to get Willow to loosen her grip on him were met with outright dismissal. Eric chafed under her thumb and was upset that he had only a few more privileges than Willow's 6-year-old daughter, and, seemingly, a few less than her 12-year-old son. Eric was looking forward to the weekend. Although he was unhappy about having to join Alice at her ballet class, he was looking forward to spending more time alone in his room where he could explore the male thoughts and hopes that he still had. He was also hoping that his time alone would give him a chance to think of a way out of the situation he found himself in. When Saturday morning came, Eric got up and ate breakfast with Adam and Willow while Alice watched her morning cartoons. Eric felt relieved that he did not have cheerleading practice that day, as the weekend practices did not start for another 3 weeks. Eric feared what that would be like, even as he pondered what his morning ballet class with Alice would hold in store for him. After breakfast, Willow instructed Eric and Alice to go upstairs and get ready for class. They both went upstairs and began to get dressed in their dance clothing. Eric sighed as he looked at the leotard and tights Willow had purchased for him during the week. Eric put on the ballet pink tights before he slipped on his black 3/4 sleeve leotard with a scoop neckline. Eric felt uncomfortable as he adjusted the leotard and put on a pair of pink yoga pants over his tights. He walked down the stairs and put on a pair of black flats and waited with his pink, canvas ballet slippers in hand for Alice to come down with Willow. Alice smiled at Eric as she found him waiting at the bottom of the stairs for them with his hair tied up just like hers. Eric could see the excitement on Alice's face. It made him feel slightly better about what he was doing, although he still disdained the thought of doing it. Eric followed Willow out to the car and she drove them to the studio. She let Eric and Alice out and told Eric to take Alice in. Eric nodded and walked inside holding Alice's hand. Madame Matthews saw Eric walk in with Alice and immediately deduced who he was. She walked over and said, "Hello, Alice, is this your lovely friend, Jasmine?" Alice nodded and said, "She sure is. It's a pleasure to meet you, Jasmine. Willow and Miss Lynn have told me a lot about you." "I bet they have," Eric replied as he walked into the dance studio part of the building. He looked around and saw that no one from the street could see inside to the dance studio. That put his mind slightly at ease as he saw a number of the young girls he would be dancing next to. The girls were all 5 or 6 years old and Eric towered over each of them. He felt foolish as the last one was brought in by their mother and they began their stretches. Eric felt as out of place as he looked beside the young girls who danced at the child's bar while he worked at the adult bar across the room. As they moved on to dance moves, Eric was admonished by Madame Matthews for his improper technique. She called for his attention and told him to focus on Alice. She instructed Eric to watch her intently and try to follow along as she danced. Eric swallowed hard and followed Madame Matthews' instructions as he tried to emulate the 6-year-old girl. Eric was relieved when the class came to an end shortly after Willow came to pick him and Alice up. Eric saw the other mothers looking at him strangely as he dressed at the end of the class and walked towards Willow. Eric felt humiliated to be seen working on his dance moves with such young children, but he was in no position to complain. Willow drove Eric and Alice home. Shortly after she let them inside, Willow said, "Jasmine, I need you to look after Jasmine this afternoon. I'm going out with her and Adam tonight to a friend's house, but I need to get some stuff first. Okay?" Eric nodded and said, "Of course, Willow. Thanks. Ordinarily I'd have Adam do it, but he's out of the house all afternoon at his baseball game."